In 1815, London's marriage mart was less of a dance and more of a meat market, and Beatrice was considered expired goods. "No gentleman will want you," her mother had sneered, eyes raking over Beatrice's ink-stained fingers and unapologetic posture. It was a sentence of exile, meant to banish and forget her. Society and her mother, however, forgot one crucial detail. Dukes rarely follow the rules of mere gentlemen, especially when they are entirely sick of perfection and starving for something real. The trunk shut with a sound like a guillotine. Beatrice Harrington didn't flinch. She simply watched as the maid, a young girl with terrified eyes, fumbled with the brass latches. The room was already stripped bare of her presence. No books on the nightstand, no haphazardly folded shawls on the settee, just the smell of beeswax and the oppressive chill of a London morning in late autumn. "Leave it!" Lady Harrington snapped from the doorway. The maid scurried out like a whipped dog, leaving mother and daughter in the echoing chamber. Lady Harrington was a woman constructed entirely of whalebone and social ambition. She did not age, she merely hardened. She stepped into the room, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards. She carried a ledger in her mind, and for 26 years, Beatrice had been a plummeting asset. "You are leaving on the midday coach," her mother said. It was not a conversation. It was a verdict. "A coach, mother?" Beatrice asked, her voice deliberately flat. "Not even the secondary carriage? Am I to share a bench with a farmer and his chickens all the way to Yorkshire?" "You will share it with whoever pays the fare. We can no longer afford to pretend you are a lady of leisure, Beatrice." Lady Harrington stepped closer, her eyes cold and dissecting. She looked at Beatrice's hair, an uncooperative shade of dark brown that refused to hold a curl. She looked at her jaw, too square, too stubborn. And finally, she looked at the ink stain on her middle finger, the undeniable proof of Beatrice's unforgivable habit of writing political essays under a male pseudonym. "Cecily is to be married in the spring," her mother continued. "Lord Hastings has finally offered for her. We need the house in order. We need the funds directed toward a proper trousseau. What we do not need is a 26-year-old spinster lurking in the corners of our ballrooms, terrifying suitors with her opinions on the corn laws." Beatrice swallowed the tight knot in her throat. She loved her younger sister. Cecily was sweet, entirely vacuous, and built for the life she was about to step into. But the dismissal still stung. It was one thing to know you were a failure in your world's eyes. It was another to be evicted for it. "I have never interfered with Cecily's prospects," Beatrice said. "Your very existence interferes." Lady Harrington's voice cracked like a whip. "Do you know what Lady Jersey called you last night? The Harrington Gargoyle. You sit there, glaring at the room, refusing to dance, refusing to smile. You laugh too loudly. You argue with men. You wear your intelligence like a weapon, Beatrice, and it has severed every tie you might have made." Beatrice looked down at her hands. She rubbed the ink stain. "I simply refuse to agree with Lord Barningham that women possess a smaller brain capacity than spaniels. Forgive me for lacking the diplomacy to nod at an idiot. And that is exactly why you are going to Aunt Hester's." Lady Harrington turned her back, walking toward the door. The conversation was over. "You will live quietly in Yorkshire. You will not write. You will not speak out of turn. You are a liability, a stone around your sister's neck. Pack the rest of your drab gowns. No gentleman will want you, Beatrice. It is time you accepted your irrelevance." The door clicked shut. Beatrice stood alone in the center of the room. She did not cry. Crying was for women who believed things could be different. Instead, she walked to the mirror. She studied her reflection. She saw the square jaw, the sharp hazel eyes, the pale skin that never flushed prettily. Her mother was right. She was not meant for this world of silk and simpering. She turned away, grabbed her worn woolen cloak and threw it over her shoulders. She had a coach to catch. The coach ride north was a rhythmic, bone-rattling nightmare. Rain lashed against the cracked leather windows, turning the English countryside into a smear of grey and brown. Beatrice sat wedged between a snoring merchant and a wet basket of turnips, her knees aching, her boots soaked through. To distract herself from the cold, she let her mind drift back. Not to the argument with her mother, but to 3 nights ago, the night she supposedly ruined her life forever at the Hastings ball. It had been suffocating. The heat of 100 wax candles and the cloying scent of crushed gardenias had driven Beatrice from the ballroom. She had slipped into the Hastings' expansive glass conservatory, seeking oxygen. She thought she was alone. She had found a marble bench, hidden behind a monstrously large fern, kicked off her tight slippers, and let her head fall back against the cold glass wall, closing her eyes. "If you are going to faint, please do it quietly. I have a terrible headache." Beatrice had snapped her eyes open. Sitting in the shadows on an opposite bench was a man. He was tall, his long legs stretched out, crossing at the ankles in a pair of scuffed evening boots that had definitely seen better days. His cravat was already undone, hanging loose around his neck. He held a glass of amber liquid in one hand, resting it on a thigh clad in immaculate, though slightly rumpled black wool. He wasn't handsome in the classical sense. His nose had distinctly been broken at some point in his life, and his jaw was shadowed with the start of a beard. He looked dangerous, exhausted, and entirely out of place amidst the manicured orchids. "I never faint," Beatrice had replied smoothly, refusing to put her slippers back on. Let him be scandalized. "I was merely calculating the exact mathematical probability of dying from boredom." The man paused, the glass halfway to his mouth. A slow, genuine laugh rumbled in his chest. "And the verdict?" "High, extremely high, especially if Lord Barningham corners me again to discuss his hunting hounds." The man took a sip of his drink, his pale eyes studying her through the gloom. "Ah, Barningham, a man whose dogs are vastly more intelligent than he is. You are the Harrington girl. The eldest. The spinster. The gargoyle. Yes, that's me." Beatrice leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "And who are you? A disgruntled cousin? A debt collector who wandered into the wrong party?" He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, but it changed the hard lines of his face. "Something like that." "Tell me, Miss Harrington, why do you come to these things if you despise them so entirely?" "Because I am a woman," she stated, the bitterness leaking through her careful armor. "I do not own property. I do not have a profession. My survival depends entirely on my ability to stand in a room and allow men like you to assess my market value. And since my market value is currently roughly equivalent to a lame horse, my mother insists I parade myself twice as hard." She expected him to act shocked, or to offer a platitude. Men hated raw honesty from women. Instead, he tilted his head. "And you refuse to play the game?" "I refuse to lose myself in it," she corrected quietly. "I will not pretend to be stupid to make a man feel clever. I will not pretend to be weak so a man can feel strong. If that means I die alone in a drafty cottage, so be it. I'd rather be a lonely human being than a well-kept pet." The silence that stretched between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, charged. The man stared at her, the mocking light entirely gone from his eyes. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he had been trying to solve his entire life, and suddenly the pieces had snapped together. He stood up. He was massive, broad-shouldered and imposing. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace. He walked over to her, his dark eyes fixed on her face. "Put your shoes on, Miss Harrington," he said softly. "Why?" "Because I'm going to ask you to dance, and if I step on your bare feet, I fear you might stab me." Beatrice laughed, a sharp, genuine sound. "I don't dance, and I don't know your name. I am not in the habit of taking to the floor with anonymous debt collectors." He reached out, his large, warm hand closing gently around hers, calluses rough against her smooth skin. "Arthur," he said. "My name is Arthur Pendleton." Beatrice froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The name was a thunderclap in the quiet conservatory. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Waverley. He had returned to England only a month ago after years abroad, inheriting the dukedom after his brother's tragic death. He was notoriously reclusive, notoriously wealthy, and notoriously cynical. The women of the ton had been tearing each other apart trying to get an introduction. Beatrice looked down at his hand, holding hers. Then she looked up into his face. "You're Duke of Waverley," she whispered. "I apologize," he said, and there was a wry, almost sad twist to his mouth. "Does that lower my market value?" "It makes you dangerous," she replied, pulling her hand back. She shoved her feet into her slippers and stood. "Dukes do not dance with gargoyles, Your Grace. They dance with girls like my sister. Perfect, biddable, beautiful girls." "I am sick to death of perfect girls," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, rough timbre. "They bore me to tears." "Then find a hobby. I will not be your brief amusement." Beatrice turned and fled the conservatory, her heart hammering against her ribs, leaving the Duke standing alone in the shadows. A jolt from the carriage snapped Beatrice back to the present. The merchant beside her snorted and shifted. She looked out the rain-streaked window. 3 days had passed since that night. He had probably forgotten her the moment she walked away. She was nothing but a momentary anomaly in his glittering world. Aunt Hester's cottage was not a cottage. It was a rotting stone hovel, clinging to the edge of the Yorkshire moors like a desperate barnacle. By the time Beatrice arrived, it was well past dark on her second day there. The storm that had followed her from London had evolved into a furious, screaming gale. The wind tore across the heather, rattling the thin glass panes of the windows. Inside, the environment was only marginally better. Aunt Hester, a deaf and fiercely bitter woman who smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and damp wool, had already gone to bed, leaving Beatrice a single tallow candle and a meagre fire struggling in the hearth. Beatrice sat in a hard-backed wooden chair, wrapped in 2 blankets, staring into the dying embers. The reality of her exile was settling into her bones. This was it. For the rest of her life, this was her view. Grey stones, wet wood, silence. Her mother had won. She pulled her knees to her chest, shivering as a draught sliced through the cracks in the floorboards. She thought of London. She thought of the warm library at home. She thought, entirely against her will, of large, calloused hands and pale eyes in a dim conservatory. "Stop it," she told herself brutally. "You are 26. You are ruined. You are alone." Suddenly, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. Beatrice stiffened. It was a rhythmic, heavy thudding. Too rhythmic to be a loose shutter. It sounded like hoofbeats, coming up the muddy track toward the cottage. She stood up, letting the blankets fall from her shoulders. She walked to the window. but the glass was opaque with rain and darkness. Then came the pounding. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the desperate, violent hammering of someone trying to break the heavy oak door down. "Hello!" a voice roared, muffled by the storm, but vibrating with authority. "Open the door!" Beatrice's heart vaulted into her throat. Highwaymen? Out here? She looked around for a weapon, her eyes landing on the heavy iron fire poker. She grabbed it, her knuckles turning white, and moved toward the tiny entryway. The pounding happened again, rattling out the hinges. "Miss Harrington! Beatrice! Open this damn door!" Her breath vanished. She knew that voice. It was impossible, absolutely insane, but she knew that rough, deep timbre. She unlatched the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open just a fraction. The wind violently wrenched the door from her grip, slamming it open against the interior wall. Rain lashed into the hallway, soaking Beatrice instantly. Standing on the threshold was a nightmare of mud and fury. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Waverley, stood gasping for breath. He was soaked to the bone. His expensive greatcoat was heavy with water and plastered with dark Yorkshire mud. He held a riding crop in one hand, his chest heaving as if he had run the entire distance himself. His usually immaculate hair was plastered to his forehead, dripping water into his eyes. Behind him, she could see a massive black stallion, head down, sides heaving, steaming in the cold air. "What?" Beatrice gasped, stepping back, the fire poker hanging limply in her hand. "What are you doing here?" Arthur stepped over the threshold, closing the door behind him with a resounding slam, cutting off the shriek of the wind. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of water dripping from his clothes onto the bare floorboards and his harsh breathing. He looked around the miserable, cramped hallway. He looked at the cracked plaster, the meager light, the freezing draught. Then he looked at Beatrice. He looked at her worn wool dress, her unbound, messy hair, and the fire poker in her hand. The anger that had been radiating off him seemed to crack, replaced by something entirely different, something painfully vulnerable. "I went to your house," he said, his voice raspy, vibrating in the small space. "Yesterday morning, I went to call on you. Your mother." He stopped, his jaw clenching so hard, a muscle ticked in his cheek. He took a step closer. He smelled of rain, leather, and exhausted horse. "Your mother told me you were gone. Banished, because of your unfortunate disposition." Beatrice swallowed hard, her pride flaring up, a shield against the absolute absurdity of this moment. "My disposition is perfectly fine. It is my lack of a dowry and my surplus of opinions that are the problem. You shouldn't be here, Your Grace. This is completely improper." "Improper?" Arthur let out a rough, barking laugh. He tossed his riding crop onto a rickety table. He stripped off his soaked leather gloves, throwing them beside it. "Miss Harrington, Beatrice, I just rode for 34 hours, straight through a torrential storm. I broke down 2 hired horses before buying a hunter from a startled farmer in Nottingham just to get here." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He was so large he seemed to dwarf the entire cottage. "Do not speak to me of propriety." "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Why would you do that?" Arthur stopped mere inches from her. He reached out. He didn't grab her. He just gently touched the side of her face with his cold, wet fingers, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. "Because," he said softly, his pale eyes burning into hers, "you told me you would rather die alone than be a well-kept pet, and I realized, 5 minutes after you walked away from me, that I could not let you do either." Beatrice stared up at him, The cynical armor she had spent 26 years building felt perfectly, terribly brittle. "I am a ruined spinster, Arthur," she said, using his name for the first time, laying out the ledger of her life one last time. "I have no money. I will embarrass you in society. I will argue with your friends. I am expired goods." Arthur smiled, that same genuine, world-weary smile from the conservatory. "Good. I have enough money for both of us. My friends are idiots who need arguing with. And as for society..." He leaned down, his forehead resting lightly against hers, the cold wetness of his skin a shocking contrast to the heat rushing through her veins. "To hell with society. I am the Duke of Waverley, and I have come to collect my gargoyle." The romanticism of a desperate midnight ride dies a swift death in the face of impending hypothermia. Arthur's forehead was burning against hers, but a violent shiver suddenly racked his massive frame. The adrenaline that had propelled him across the country was evaporating, leaving behind the stark, brutal reality of wet wool, freezing drafts, and exhaustion. His knees actually buckled a fraction of an inch. Beatrice stepped back instantly. The cynical, practical part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive in London drawing rooms, snapped back into control. "You are freezing to death," she said. It wasn't a romantic observation. It was a statement of fact. She looked down. A puddle of muddy water was actively expanding around his boots, soaking into Aunt Hester's frayed rag rug. "I am perfectly fine," Arthur gritted out, his teeth chattering so audibly it ruined the arrogant effect entirely. He swayed, catching himself on the edge of the flimsy entryway table. The wood groaned under his weight. "You are an idiot," Beatrice countered. She grabbed his arm. It felt like grabbing a block of ice wrapped in wet leather. "Take the boots off. Now, before my aunt wakes up and shoots you for a footpad." Arthur blinked, the fierce intensity in his eyes dulling into confusion. "Shoots me?" She has a musket from the American War and terrible eyesight. Boots off. It took 10 minutes to strip the Duke of Waverley of his ruined outer garments. Beatrice dragged him into the cramped, low-ceilinged kitchen. She shoved him into a wooden chair by the hearth and built the fire up with the last of the dry peat and kindling. He sat there in a damp linen shirt and sodden breeches, his long legs stretched toward the smoking flames, shivering violently while she boiled water in a battered iron kettle. She handed him a chipped mug of weak tea. He wrapped his large hands around it, staring at the brownish liquid as if it were poison. "It's not poisoned, it's just cheap," Beatrice said, pulling her blanket tighter around her own shoulders and sitting on a stool opposite him. "Drink it, and then you are going to tell me exactly what you think you are doing." Arthur took a scalding sip. He closed his eyes, the heat finally bringing a faint rush of color back to his pale, mud-splattered face. "I told you. I came to get you." "To get me?" Beatrice repeated flatly. "Like a stray dog, or a misplaced umbrella? And then what, Arthur? You put me up in a townhouse in Mayfair? You visit me on Tuesdays and Thursdays when your society wife is occupied with her embroidery?" Arthur's eyes snapped open. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. "Do not insult me. I am trying to understand you. Because the alternative is that you rode through a tempest to ask a penniless, socially radioactive spinster to marry you. And that is mathematically impossible." "Damn the mathematics," Arthur growled. He set the mug down on the stone hearth with a sharp clack. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze locking onto hers. "I'm 29 years old, Beatrice. I spent 5 years on the continent, watching men bleed into the mud for lines drawn on maps. When my brother died, I came back to inherit a life I never wanted, surrounded by people who smile at my face and calculate my worth behind their fans. You are the first person in 3 years who has looked at me and actually spoken the truth. So you are proposing marriage based on my lack of manners? I am proposing marriage, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, rough rumble that made the small kitchen feel even smaller. Because when you walked out of that conservatory, the entire world went grey. Because I realized I would rather spend the rest of my life arguing with you in a damp cottage than spend one more evening being agreed with by women who bore me. Beatrice stared at him. Her throat was tight. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But survival meant seeing the trap before it snapped shut. My mother will say I trapped you, she whispered. The ton will say you went mad. They will eat us alive. Let them try. Arthur's jaw set into a brutal line. I am a duke. They will bow when I tell them to bow. And you will stand beside me and tell them exactly what you think of their bowing. A floorboard creaked above them. Beatrice stiffened. Aunt Hester. Before Arthur could ask who Aunt Hester was, the narrow kitchen door swung open. Standing in the doorway was a frail woman in a voluminous flannel nightgown, clutching a broom handle like a spear. Her thinning grey hair stuck out in wild tufts from under a linen cap. She squinted through the gloom at the massive, half-dressed man sitting by her hearth. Who in the devil are you? Hester barked, her voice raspy and deafeningly loud. She pointed the broom at Arthur. Are you the butcher's boy? Because I told that cheating scoundrel I wouldn't pay for gristle. Arthur slowly stood up. Even without his boots, he towered over the old woman. He offered a remarkably elegant bow for a man in wet trousers. Madam, Arthur said loudly, projecting over the crackle of the fire, I am the Duke of Waverley. I have come to marry your niece. Aunt Hester stared at him. She lowered the broom slightly. She looked at Beatrice. Then she looked back at Arthur. She walked forward, peering closely at the mud on his face and the expensive, albeit ruined, linen of his shirt. A duke, Hester said flatly. Yes, madam. Do dukes typically track mud all over a clean kitchen floor at 3 in the morning? Only when provoked, madam. Hester snorted. It was a harsh, thoroughly unladylike sound. Well, if you're taking the girl, take her quickly. She reads too much and she uses all my lamp oil. She turned on her heel. And leave £10 on the table for the rug you ruined. The door clicked shut. Arthur looked at the closed door, then turned slowly back to Beatrice. The corner of his mouth twitched. I like her. Beatrice buried her face in her hands. A hysterical, raw laugh escaped her chest. It was absurd. All of it was entirely, wonderfully absurd. She looked up at him, at this giant, stubborn man who had torn her reality apart in a matter of hours. Fine, Beatrice said, her voice shaking only slightly. £10 for the rug, and I want my own study, with a lock on the door. Arthur's smile finally broke through the exhaustion. Done. They did not leave immediately. Arthur, despite his iron will, was human. After writing a heavily funded promissory note to Aunt Hester, who inspected the vowels with a suspicious glare, he collapsed onto the small cot in the back room and slept for 14 hours straight. By the time he woke, his valet had arrived. The valet, a stoic man named Hughes, had been trailing his master in a heavily sprung travelling chariot. Hughes did not blink at the sight of his employer in a Yorkshire hovel. He merely produced a fresh suit of clothes from a trunk, heated water for a shave, and looked at Beatrice with an expression of polite, unshakable neutrality. They departed at dawn the next day. The storm had blown itself out, leaving the moors scrubbed clean and bitterly cold. The carriage was a sensory shock. After days of draughty coaches and damp cottages, Beatrice found herself sinking into deep maroon velvet. The air smelled of expensive leather, beeswax, and the faint, spicy scent of Arthur's shaving soap. Hot bricks had been placed at their feet. It was a rolling fortress of wealth. They sat opposite each other. The physical proximity was suddenly suffocating. In the dark, muddy cottage, he had been a savior. Here, in the clear, harsh light of morning, dressed in an immaculate charcoal morning coat, a crisp white cravat, and polished hessians, he was the Duke of Waverley. The reality of his power sat heavily between them. For the first 30 miles, they barely spoke. The rhythm of the wheels over the rutted roads filled the silence. Beatrice kept her gaze fixed out the window, watching the dry stone walls blur past, her hands tightly folded in her lap to hide the fact that her knuckles were white. "You are calculating the odds of a disaster again," Arthur said quietly. Beatrice turned her head. He was watching her. He looked rested, but the harsh, cynical lines around his mouth remained. He wasn't a soft man. He would never be a soft man. "I am merely contemplating the logistics," she replied, lifting her chin. "Where are we going?" "Somerton Park. It is my primary estate in Derbyshire. We will be married there by special license." "And then?" "And then we go to London." He leaned back against the squabs, crossing his long legs. "And we watch the ton choke on their collective outrage." Beatrice frowned. "You enjoy it. You enjoy the destruction of their expectations. I despise their expectations. There is a difference." Arthur looked away from her, staring out the opposite window. The teasing light vanished from his eyes, replaced by something cold and impenetrable. "My brother Thomas lived for their expectations. He was the perfect heir. Perfect manners, perfect marriage prospects, perfectly agreeable to every bloated lord in Parliament." Beatrice stayed quiet. The ton still spoke of the late Duke of Waverley in hushed, reverent tones. "A tragic accident," they said. "A hunting mishap." "It wasn't an accident," Arthur said, reading her silence. His voice was devoid of emotion, which made the words all the more terrifying. "Thomas was challenged to a duel by a drunken viscount over a perceived slight at a card game. It was a stupid, meaningless argument. But Thomas couldn't refuse. His honor, his perfect reputation, demanded he accept. He stood on a wet field at dawn and let a fool put a bullet in his chest because he was terrified of a scandal." Arthur turned his gaze back to Beatrice. "Perfection killed my brother. Beatrice. The absolute, unyielding pressure to conform to a society of hypocrites put him in the ground. When I inherited, I swore I would never let them dictate my life. I will not smile at their insults. I will not play their games." He leaned forward, the space between them vanishing. "And I will not marry one of their daughters. I will not bring a woman into my home who will spend her life curating my image." Beatrice felt a profound ache in her chest. She had thought his pursuit of her was a rebellion. She realized now it was a survival tactic. He was drowning in his own cynicism, looking for someone who understood the current. "So I am your shield?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "A deliberate insult to the people who killed your brother?" Arthur closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a muscle working in his jaw. "No, you are not an insult. You are the only real thing in a world made of paper. You fight back, Beatrice. You don't cower. When I saw you in that conservatory, you were bleeding from a dozen social wounds, and yet you sat there and dared the world to strike you again. I don't want a shield. I want an ally. He reached across the space, his large hand gently covering her tightly folded ones. His thumb brushed over the ink stain on her middle finger. I will give you the protection of my title, Arthur said, his voice a low, fierce vow. I will give you a library that will make you weep. I will give you the freedom to write your essays, to argue your politics, to be exactly who you are. All I ask in return is that you stand beside me, and that you never, ever lie to me. Beatrice looked down at his hand over hers. The warmth of his skin seeped through her cheap wool gloves. She thought of her mother's sneer. No gentleman will want you. Her mother was right. She didn't want a gentleman. She wanted a partner. She turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers with his. She looked up, meeting his intense gaze. Then we have a bargain, Your Grace, she said. But if you ever try to tell me what to wear, I will use Aunt Hester's musket. Arthur let out a sudden, barking laugh that startled the horses outside. The heavy, dark atmosphere in the carriage shattered, replaced by something fragile, terrifying, and brilliantly alive. Somerton Park did not just emerge from the landscape, it dominated it. As the carriage swept through the massive wrought-iron gates, Beatrice pressed her face against the glass. The driveway was a mile-long avenue of ancient, twisting oaks. At the end of it sat a sprawling, Palladian masterpiece of pale limestone. It looked less like a home and more like a national monument. Rows of towering windows caught the late afternoon sun, glittering like a wall of diamonds. Beatrice looked down at her dress. It was a drab brown merino wool, frayed at the hem, wrinkled from the journey, and smelling faintly of peat smoke. She touched her hair, which was twisted into a hurried, messy knot at the nape of her neck. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her armor. She was a gentlewoman, yes, but her father was a baron whose debts far outweighed his assets. This was a different stratosphere of wealth and power. This was a house that hosted royalty, and she was arriving looking like a displaced scullery maid. The carriage slowed to a halt in front of a sweeping marble staircase. Before the footman could even open the door, Arthur was moving. He stepped out first, turning to offer her his hand. Beatrice hesitated. She looked at his hand, then up at his face. I look like a vagrant, she whispered, the confession torn from her. Your staff will think you've lost your mind. Arthur did not smile. He didn't offer a patronizing platitude about her inner beauty. He simply leaned into the carriage, his massive frame blocking out the view of the intimidating house. My staff are paid to manage the house, not my life, he said firmly. And if anyone so much as looks at you with anything less than absolute respect, they will be looking for new employment before supper. You are Beatrice Harrington. You bow to no one in this house. Do you understand me? His absolute certainty was a physical force. Beatrice took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. She placed her hand in his. I understand. She stepped out of the carriage. Waiting at the top of the marble stairs was a formidable line of servants, standing at rigid attention. At the head of the line stood the butler, a man who looked entirely carved from mahogany, and a housekeeper in stiff black silk, whose expression was as welcoming as a closed coffin. Arthur kept Beatrice's hand firmly tucked into the crook of his arm. He did not rush. He walked her up the stairs with a slow, deliberate cadence, forcing the staff to wait, to watch. Welcome home, Your Grace, the butler intoned, bowing deeply. The entire line of servants followed suit in a wave of black and grey. Thank you, Harrison, Arthur said briskly. He did not stop walking, pulling Beatrice past them into the grand foyer. It was a cavernous space of checkered marble, soaring columns, and a sweeping double staircase. "This is Miss Harrington. She is to be the Duchess of Waverley by the end of the week. You will afford her every courtesy, every obedience, and every comfort this house possesses." Beatrice felt the collective silent gasp of 50 servants. She kept her chin high, her spine perfectly straight. She felt the housekeeper's eyes burning into the frayed hem of her dress. "Mrs. Higgins," Arthur barked, halting in the center of the foyer. The housekeeper stepped forward, her face a mask of professional neutrality that barely concealed her shock. "Yes, Your Grace. Miss Harrington has had a grueling journey. Prepare the Queen's suite, have a bath drawn, and send for a modiste from Derby immediately. She will need an entire wardrobe before we travel to London." "At once, Your Grace," Mrs. Higgins murmured, dropping a flawless curtsy. "I do not need the Queen's suite, Arthur," Beatrice hissed under her breath as the servants scattered to execute his orders. "I am not royalty." "You are here," Arthur replied, looking down at her. "That makes it yours." He didn't give her time to argue. He tugged her gently down a long, portrait-lined corridor. The ancestors of the Waverley line glared down at them in oils and heavy gilded frames. Beatrice felt their judgment, centuries of aristocratic purity scoffing at the ink-stained gargoyle, dirtying their pristine floors. Arthur stopped in front of a set of towering double doors made of carved walnut. He pushed them open. "You asked for a study," he said quietly, stepping aside. Beatrice walked past him and stopped dead. It wasn't a study. It was a cathedral of knowledge. The library spanned 2 full stories, wrapped entirely in rich, dark mahogany bookshelves that stretched from the parquet floor to a domed, frescoed ceiling. A brass spiral staircase led to a wraparound balcony holding even more volumes. Deep leather armchairs surrounded a massive roaring fireplace. The smell of old paper, leather bindings, and wood smoke hit her like a physical blow. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She walked slowly into the center of the room, spinning in a slow circle. There were thousands of books: history, philosophy, science, poetry. Wealth wasn't just carriages and jewels. This was the true power of a duke. She turned to look at Arthur. He was leaning against the heavy wooden door frame, watching her. The hard, cynical edge was gone from his face. He looked at her with a quiet, profound satisfaction, watching the awe light up her features. "You said you refused to be a well-kept pet," Arthur said, his voice echoing softly in the vast room. "I told you I wanted an ally. This is your arsenal, Beatrice. Rud them. Write your essays. Tear my friends' arguments to shreds. Reign here." Beatrice swallowed the sudden, sharp lump in her throat. Her mother had looked at her intellect as a deformity. Arthur looked at it as her greatest asset. She walked back toward him, her worn boots making soft sounds on the expensive rugs. She stopped right in front of him. She didn't say thank you. Thank you was too small a word for handing someone the keys to a kingdom. Instead, she reached up, grabbed the lapels of his immaculate coat, pulled him down, and kissed him. It wasn't a tentative maidenly kiss. It was fiercely possessive, driven by adrenaline, relief, and a sudden, consuming fire. Arthur groaned, his arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her off her feet. He kissed her back with a desperate, starving intensity. The kind of kiss from a man who had been suffocating in polite society, and had finally broken the surface to breathe. When they finally broke apart, Beatrice was breathless, her hand still clutching his coat. "Tomorrow," Beatrice said, her voice shaking, "I will face the modiste. And next week, I will face London. And I will make them regret ever calling me a gargoyle." Arthur smiled, a dangerous, feral grin that made his broken nose look entirely roguish. "I pity them already." The modiste arrived from Derby in a flurry of velvet swatches and measuring tapes, her eyes wide with the scandal of being summoned to the Duke's estate for an unknown woman. Madame Fortin was a shrewd woman who had dressed 3 generations of provincial aristocracy. She took one look at Beatrice's square jaw, her unyielding posture, and the ink still clinging to her cuticles, and immediately reached for a bolt of pale peach silk. To soften the features, Madame Fortin explained, draping the insipid fabric across Beatrice's shoulder in the guest suite. With a ruffle at the collar, to draw the eye away from the angularity of the jawline, Beatrice looked at her reflection in the towering cheval glass. The peach silk made her look like a corpse that had died of a fever. It was the exact shade her mother had forced her to wear for 3 grueling seasons. It was the color of submission. Arthur had been leaning against the doorframe, a cup of coffee in his hand, observing the process with an unreadable expression. He had refused to leave the room, completely ignoring the modiste's horrified protests about propriety. Beatrice caught his eye in the mirror. He raised a single, questioning eyebrow. She turned back to the modiste and pulled the peach silk from her shoulder. She let it drop to the floor. "No," Beatrice said. Madame Fortin blinked. "Pardon, miss? I am not a peach, Madame Fortin. I do not need softening." Beatrice walked over to the open trunks of fabric samples. She bypassed the pastels, the delicate muslins, the flowered silks. She stopped at a heavy, dark bolt of material at the bottom. She hauled it out. It was a rich, deep, midnight blue velvet, so dark it almost swallowed the light. "This," Beatrice said. She pulled out another. "And this charcoal grey wool, and that dark emerald silk. I want structure, high collars, long sleeves. I do not want ruffles. I do not want lace. And if you attempt to put a silk flower anywhere on my person, I will burn the garment." Madame Fortin gasped, clutching a measuring tape to her chest. She looked to the Duke, expecting him to overrule this madness. Dukes wanted pretty, decorative wives. They did not want women dressed like military commanders. Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee. He pushed off the doorframe and walked over to Beatrice. He reached out and touched the heavy midnight blue velvet she held. "Can you work with these, madam?" Arthur asked softly, not looking at the modiste, his eyes entirely focused on Beatrice. "Your Grace, the current fashion in London." "I do not care about London," Arthur cut her off, his voice quiet but possessing the weight of a falling anvil. "I care about the Duchess. Can you make the garments she has requested, or shall I send my carriage to Manchester for someone who can?" Madame Fortin swallowed hard. "I can make them, Your Grace, but the cut, it will be severe." "Good," Beatrice said, stepping back in front of the mirror, holding the dark velvet against her chest. "I intend to be severe." They were married 3 days later in the estate's private chapel. There were no flowers. There were no weeping relatives. There was only the cavernous, echoing stone of the ancient chapel, the vicar, whose hands shook slightly as he held the Book of Common Prayer, and Hughes the valet standing as a witness. Beatrice wore a walking dress of the charcoal wool Madame Fortin had scrambled to finish, tailored so perfectly to her frame it felt like a second skin. It possessed no embellishments, only clean, sharp lines that highlighted her posture. She wore no veil. She looked the vicar directly in the eye as she spoke her vows. When it came time for Arthur to speak, he did not look at the vicar. He turned his massive frame, taking both of her hands in his. He was dressed in stark black and white, looking every inch the terrifying, unyielding lord of the realm. But his hands were warm. "With this ring I thee wed," Arthur said. His voice echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. He slid a heavy, ancient gold band onto her finger. It was too large, meant for a man's hand, a Waverley heirloom pulled from the vault that morning. It swallowed her knuckle. He didn't release her hands. "And with my worldly goods, I thee endow." It wasn't just a vow. It was a transfer of ammunition. They did not kiss in the chapel. The air was too heavy, the moment too solemn. But as they walked out of the heavy oak doors and into the biting autumn wind, Arthur pulled her close, wrapping her in his heavy wool greatcoat, shielding her from the cold. "You are mine now, gargoyle," he murmured into her hair. "We belong to each other," Beatrice corrected, leaning into the solid, unmoving wall of his chest. "Do not think you are the only one who has acquired property today." Arthur laughed, a rich, booming sound that carried across the vast lawns of Somerton Park. The journey back to London took 4 days. They travelled with an entourage that rivaled a royal procession. The closer they got to the city, the more the tension coiled in Beatrice's stomach. The adrenaline of the Yorkshire cottage and the Derbyshire wedding was fading, replaced by the cold, hard mathematics of what they were about to do. They were going to war. On the afternoon they finally crossed into Mayfair, the sky was a bruised, oppressive grey. The Waverley townhouse was a massive stone monolith in Grosvenor Square, its tall windows staring out at the manicured gardens like unblinking eyes. As the carriage slowed, Beatrice looked down at her hands. The gold ring weighed heavy on her left hand. "Are you afraid?" Arthur asked, seated opposite her, a stack of parliamentary reports resting on his knee. He had spent the last 2 days explaining the complexities of the current agricultural tariffs to her, genuinely listening as she dismantled the logic of his peers. "I am calculating," Beatrice said honestly. "News of our marriage will have reached them by now. The special license would have been recorded. My mother—" She stopped. Her chest tightened. "My mother will be telling everyone I compromised you, that I manipulated a grieving, reclusive duke into a trap." Arthur closed the report. He tossed it onto the seat beside him. "Let her." "Arthur, if they believe I am a conniving—" "Beatrice!" He leaned forward, catching her chin in his rough hand, forcing her to look at him. "You are the Duchess of Waverley. You do not need to explain yourself to the people who reside in this city. You own this city. Tonight, the Duke of Devonshire is hosting the opening ball of the winter session. We will attend." Beatrice's breath hitched. "Tonight? But we have only just arrived. A prolonged absence only breeds more rumours. We will strike while the iron is hot. You will wear the midnight blue velvet, and you will wear the Waverley sapphires, and you will walk into that ballroom and you will look them all in the eye." He dropped his hand from her chin, his expression fiercely protective. "They threw you away, Beatrice. Tonight you make them realize exactly what it is they discarded. The Duke of Devonshire's ballroom was a sea of crushed silk, glittering diamonds, and suffocating hypocrisy. The heat from 5 massive chandeliers pressed down on the crowd. Lady Harrington stood near the punch bowls, vibrating with a toxic mixture of triumph and absolute rage. She had spent the last 3 days fielding questions from the ton. "Is it true? Did your spinster daughter truly ensnare Waverley?" She had played the part of the shocked, deeply embarrassed mother perfectly. She had painted Beatrice as a desperate opportunist who had ambushed the Duke in his grief. The narrative was set. Society had already sharpened its knives. They were ready to cut the new Duchess down the moment she showed her face. Beside her, Cecily shifted nervously in her pale pink tulle. "Do you really think she'll come tonight, Mother?" "Of course she will," Lady Harrington sneered behind her ivory fan. "She will want to parade her ill-gotten gains. But a title cannot fix a gargoyle, Cecily. She will wear something hideous, say something atrocious, and Waverley will realize the terrible mistake he has made. He will likely banish her to his country estate by Christmas. At the top of the grand staircase, the majordomo struck his heavy staff against the marble floor. The sharp crack echoed over the din of the orchestra. The music faltered. The hundreds of voices in the ballroom began to die down, dropping into a hushed collective silence. "Their Graces!" the majordomo bellowed, his voice ringing off the gilded ceiling. "The Duke and Duchess of Waverley." Lady Harrington snapped her fan shut. Every head in the room turned toward the staircase. Arthur appeared first, descending the first step. He was a leviathan in a sea of peacocks. He wore no elaborate embroidery, no flashy waistcoats. He was dressed in severe, flawless black evening wear, his cravat tied with mathematical precision. He looked dangerous. He looked like a man who could buy the entire room and burn it to the ground for his own amusement. Then he turned slightly and offered his arm. Beatrice stepped into the light. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the ballroom. She did not look like the Harrington gargoyle. She did not look softened, or tamed, or prettied up for society's consumption. She looked like a queen stepping onto a battlefield. She wore the midnight blue velvet. The gown possessed long, fitted sleeves and a high, square neckline that framed her collarbones perfectly. The structure of the dress amplified her natural, unyielding posture. She stood completely straight, her shoulders back, her square jaw set with absolute, terrifying confidence. And around her throat lay the Waverley sapphires. They were legendary, stones the size of robins' eggs, dripping in heavy gold, pulling the light from the chandeliers and throwing it back as blue fire. They were so heavy, so ostentatious, that they would have drowned a lesser woman. But Beatrice wore them like armor. She placed her hand on Arthur's arm. They descended the stairs in perfect unison. "Good God," Lord Barningham whispered loudly from the bottom of the stairs. "She looks formidable." Lady Harrington felt the blood drain from her face. This was not the broken, exiled daughter she had shoved into a carriage a week ago. This was a predator. As they reached the ballroom floor, the crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. Arthur did not smile. He kept his hand firmly over Beatrice's, where it rested on his arm. They walked slowly, deliberately, forcing the highest-ranking lords and ladies in England to step back and make way. They stopped in the center of the room. Arthur finally let his gaze sweep the crowd. He found Lord Barningham, who was standing with a group of older, influential peers in the Tory party. Arthur steered Beatrice directly toward them. "Waverley," Lord Barningham stuttered as they approached, bowing slightly. He looked at Beatrice and quickly averted his eyes, completely destabilized by the sapphires and the severe cut of her dress. "Congratulations are in order, it seems. We were quite surprised." "Were you?" Arthur asked, his voice a low drawl that carried perfectly in the quiet radius around them. "I find it surprising that you are surprised, Barningham. I merely acquired the most intelligent woman in London. A sound investment, wouldn't you agree?" Barningham flushed. "Well, yes. Though intelligence in a woman is a heavy burden for a household." He attempted a patronizing chuckle, looking at his peers for support. "I always say, a wife should focus on the nursery and the menus. Leave the heavy thinking to the men, eh?" Arthur did not defend her. He did not puff up his chest or yell. He simply turned his head, looked at Beatrice, and stepped back a half-inch, physically yielding the floor to her. Beatrice met Barningham's eyes. She didn't glare. She smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant smile. "A fascinating perspective, Lord Barningham," Beatrice said, her voice clear, melodic, and entirely devoid of fear. Though I suppose if one's mental capacity is already strained by the effort of managing a pack of hunting dogs, one must rely on their wife to handle the menus. Tell me, has your stance on the corn laws evolved since Tuesday? Or are you still advocating for a tariff that will starve the northern tenant farmers simply to protect your own grain margins in Sussex? The silence that followed was absolute. Barningham's mouth opened and closed like a landed trout. The older peers around him shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Beatrice and the Duke. I assure you, Duchess, the economy is highly complex, Barningham stammered. It is not complex, my lord, Beatrice interrupted smoothly, her voice ringing out. It is a basic principle of supply and elasticity. By artificially inflating the cost of domestic grain, you are reducing the disposable income of the laboring class, thereby stagnating the domestic manufacturing market. It is not just cruel, it is mathematically unsound. She quoted his own party's suppressed data points. She dismantled his argument with surgical, devastating precision. She used the vocabulary she had hidden for 26 years, wielding it like a broadsword in the middle of a ballroom. When she finished, Barningham was sweating. He looked to Arthur for help, as if expecting the Duke to rein in his unruly wife. Arthur was smiling. It was the same feral, proud smile he had given her in the library at Somerton. I would try to argue with her, Barningham, Arthur said lightly, but she tends to make me look like a fool. I suggest you retreat while you still have your dignity. Barningham bowed stiffly and practically fled toward the card room. Beatrice felt a rush of adrenaline so pure it tasted like copper. She turned, looking across the room, her eyes locked with her mother's. Lady Harrington was standing completely frozen. The narrative was shattered. Beatrice was not a victim. She had not been tamed. She was the Duchess of Waverley, and she had just humiliated a senior lord on her first night in society. And her husband had stood by and watched her do it with unconcealed pride. Beatrice held her mother's gaze for a long, heavy moment. She didn't sneer. She didn't gloat. She simply offered a very slight, very deliberate nod of her head. The ledger is closed, the nod said. And you lost. Lady Harrington looked away first. Are you satisfied? Arthur murmured in her ear, leaning down so only she could hear. Beatrice looked up at him, her hazel eyes blazing with triumph and something infinitely deeper. I'm just getting started. They left the ball 2 hours later. Arthur did not force her to stay until dawn. They had planted the flag. They did not need to salt the earth. The carriage ride back to Grosvenor Square was a stark contrast to their arrival in London. The crushing tension was gone. The silence in the velvet-lined cab was no longer heavy. It was warm, vibrating with the residual energy of the night. Beatrice leaned her head back against the squabs. The heavy Waverley sapphires rested against her collarbones, a physical reminder of the sheer weight of the power she now possessed. She unpinned her gloves, peeling the silk from her hands. She looked down at the ink stain on her middle finger. Madame Fortin's manicurist had tried to scrub it away with lemon and pumice, but it remained, a stubborn, permanent mark of who she was. Arthur watched her. He had removed his black evening coat and tossed it carelessly onto the seat beside him, his cravat already untied and hanging loose around his neck. The dangerous leviathan of the ballroom was gone, replaced once again by the exhausted, intensely perceptive man from the conservatory. You terrified them, Arthur said quietly into the dark. Good, Beatrice replied, turning her head to look at him. They have spent my entire life terrifying me, telling me I was too loud, too sharp, too much. I spent 26 years trying to fold myself into a box that was meant for my sister. I will not apologize for stretching my legs. I would never ask you to." Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The faint street lamps of London flickered through the carriage windows, casting shifting shadows across his broken nose and the hard angles of his face. "I told you I wanted an ally, Beatrice. Tonight, you proved you are an army." The carriage rattled to a stop in front of the Waverley townhouse. Footmen rushed to open the doors, but Arthur ignored them, stepping out and reaching back to lift Beatrice down himself. His hand spanned her waist, lifting her easily down to the pavement. He didn't let go immediately, holding her close against the chill of the midnight air. They walked up the steps in silence. The massive house was quiet, the staff having retreated to the shadows. Harrison the butler bowed them in, then vanished, leaving them alone in the cavernous marble foyer. Beatrice began to walk toward the grand staircase to head to her separate quarters, the Duchess's suite that Mrs. Higgins had prepared. It was the way of things. Noble marriages were transactions. They had secured the transaction publicly tonight. Now the private reality would begin. The separate bedrooms, the polite distance. "Beatrice." She stopped, her hand resting on the smooth mahogany banister. She turned back. Arthur was standing in the center of the foyer. He wasn't moving toward the stairs. He was looking at her. And the protective, arrogant mask he wore for the world was completely stripped away. He looked painfully vulnerable. "You said earlier today that we belong to each other," Arthur said, his voice a low, rough rasp in the quiet house. "Did you mean it as a legal fact? Or did you mean it?" Beatrice let her hand fall from the banister. The heavy velvet of her gown whispered against the marble as she walked slowly back toward him. "I do not deal in legal facts when I am speaking to you, Arthur," she said softly. She stopped in front of him. She looked up into his pale, fierce eyes. She saw the grief he still carried for his brother, the disgust he harbored for his peers, and the desperate, starving hope he had placed entirely on her shoulders when he rode through a tempest in Yorkshire. He hadn't rescued her. They had rescued each other. "My mother told me no gentleman would ever want me," Beatrice whispered, reaching up to rest her palm against his jaw. The faint shadow of his beard scratched pleasantly against her skin. She was right. You are not a gentleman, Arthur. You are a savage who breaks down doors in the middle of the night. Arthur let out a shaky breath, his eyes fluttering closed at her touch. "And you are a gargoyle who uses the economy to bludgeon a man to death in a ballroom. Are you going to send me to my separate suite, Your Grace?" she challenged softly. Arthur opened his eyes. The vulnerability was swallowed instantly by a dark, consuming fire. He didn't answer her with words. He wrapped his massive arms around her, lifting her entirely off the floor. Beatrice gasped as he carried her toward the back of the house, bypassing the grand staircase entirely. He kicked open the heavy oak doors of his private library, a room mirroring the one at Somerton, smelling of leather, old paper, and wood smoke. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. He set her down gently on the edge of a massive leather sofa, kneeling in front of her. He reached up and slowly, carefully unclasped the heavy Waverley sapphires from her neck. He let the priceless heirloom drop carelessly onto the rug beside them. "I don't care about the title," Arthur murmured, his hands moving to the rigid structure of her velvet collar, his long, calloused fingers working the tiny buttons with surprising gentleness. "I don't care about the estate, or the legacy, or the ton. I care about this. You. The woman who looked at me in a glass room and told me the truth." Beatrice let her hands bury themselves in his thick, dark hair. The armor she had worn all evening, the posture, the velvet, the sheer force of will, melted away. She didn't need it here, in the dark with him. She wasn't a spinster. She wasn't a duchess. She was simply Beatrice. "I will never lie to you," she breathed, pulling his face up to hers. "And I will never let you go." He kissed her, a desperate, anchoring kiss that promised a lifetime of arguments, of absolute loyalty, and of standing back to back against a world that had tried to break them both. She had been expired goods, thrown away to rot in a damp cottage. But as Arthur's arms tightened around her in the firelight, holding her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever found, Beatrice Harrington knew the truth. The ledger was closed, and she had won everything. Beatrice didn't just survive the marriage mart, she burned it to the ground. She took her mother's cruelest insult and turned it into an empire, finding a man who loved her sharp edges instead of trying to dull them. This is what happens when two outcasts find each other. They don't just survive society, they conquer it. If you loved Beatrice's brutal honesty and Arthur's midnight ride, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more deeply emotional, unapologetic romance stories. Let me know in the comments, what would you have said to Lord Barningham?